The full view here on SABC News Channel. A look at some international news. The United Nations Secretary General has told the Security Council that the dreams of a generation of young Afghans, particularly women and girls, hang in the balance. Antonio Guterres was speaking during an emergency session of the Council after the Taliban took full control of Afghanistan, including the capital Kabul, over the weekend, which saw President Ashraf Ghani flee to Tajikistan. Guterres called on the Taliban and all parties to respect and protect international humanitarian law and the rights and freedoms of all persons.
With the Taliban in full control of most of the country, uncertainty and fear reigns, as evidenced by the chaotic scenes at Kabul International Airport, as thousands are desperate to be evacuated from the country.
At this grave hour, I urge all parties, especially the Taliban, to exercise utmost restraint to protect lives and to ensure that humanitarian needs can be met. Conflict has forced hundreds of thousands from their homes. The capital city has seen a huge influx of internally displaced persons from provinces around the country where they felt insecure or fled during fighting. I remind all parties of their obligation to protect civilians. And I call on all parties to provide humanitarians with unimpeded access to deliver timely and life-saving services and aid.
He called for the international community to be united and utilize all available instruments to uphold human rights in Afghanistan and to ensure that the country was never again used as a platform or safe haven for terrorist organizations.
We are receiving chilling reports of severe restrictions on human rights throughout the country. And I am particularly concerned by accounts of mounting human rights violations against the women and girls of Afghanistan who fear a return to the darkest days. It is essential that the hard-won rights of Afghan women and girls are protected. They are looking to the international community for support, the same international community that assured them that opportunities would be expanded, education would be guaranteed, freedoms would be spread, and rights would be secured.
Afghanistan's UN envoy painted a bleak picture.
We are extremely concerned about Taliban's not honoring their promises and commitments made in their statements at Doha and at other international fora. We've witnessed time and again how Taliban have broken their promises and commitments in the past. We have seen gruesome images of Taliban's mass executions of military personnel and target killings of civilians in Kandahar and other big cities. Mr. President, we cannot allow this to happen in Kabul, which has been the last refuge for many people escaping violence and Taliban's revenge attacks.
As political pressure weighs on the White House and President Joe Biden, given chaos that has ensued despite promises of an orderly withdrawal of American troops and personnel from the country.
The inability of Afghan security forces to defend their country has played a very powerful role in what we've seen over the last few weeks. The fact is, we invested, the international community invested over 20 years, billions of dollars in these forces, 300,000 of them, with an air force, something the Taliban didn't have, with the most modern, sophisticated equipment. And unfortunately, tragically, they have not been able to defend the country. And I think that explains why this has moved as quickly as it's moved.
As the world watches, almost helpless, as its influence in Afghanistan wanes. President Joe Biden expected to address the nation later Monday as his administration faces political headwinds that some are already describing as the biggest foreign policy failure of his administration to date. What is clear is that U.S. intelligence did not foresee the Taliban's swift sweep to reclaim the country. And while the U.S. withdrawal was a process initiated under former President Donald Trump, including penning a deal with the Taliban in February 2020, this is a devolving situation that has happened under Biden's watch. And it's going to be for him to explain its parameters to the American people. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
All right, let's go back to Sherwin now to speak a little bit more about what is expected. So, Sherwin, as we mentioned, what the UN Secretary General was saying, should we expect any action from the Security Council? And if so, what tools, instruments are at their disposal for holding anyone to account?
Well, they have the ability to impose sanctions, right? But whether they will do that in the short term remains probably unclear, certainly, but it's unlikely to happen in the short term because they are essentially catching up to events on the ground, right? So the concern now is about protecting human rights. The concern now is about unimpeded humanitarian access. You face a population in Afghanistan where half of the country, essentially 18.4 million people, are already in need of humanitarian aid. So the Council's role here in particular will probably be a statement in the short term, Tshepiso, talking to the ongoing political conversations, negotiations that are happening under the auspices of the Qatari government. That is ongoing towards some sort of inclusive government in the future. But given the Taliban's advances in Afghanistan, they now have greater leverage in those talks. So what the outcome will look like is now more complicated by what we are seeing on the ground. So it's very unclear what exactly the Security Council as a collective will be able to say, but obviously a strong call from the UN Secretary General for a focus on humanitarian access and basically to uphold the human rights that have been won over the last 20 years, particularly for women and girls in Afghanistan, Tshepiso.
So, Sherwin, let's just focus on that particular point, the issues around human rights, especially for girl children and women. What are officials saying in this regards? What are the fears?
A great deal of concern, certainly. If you remember the Taliban of old, Tshepiso, this was a group that blocked girls from attending school. Women were largely barred from appearing in public without a full body cover, including a covering of the face called the burqa, and they had to have male escorts. Those who violated the rules, Tshepiso, faced public flogging or execution. So a real acute concern from UN officials, including the outgoing head of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, tweeting this on Sunday. Please spare a thought for the people, women and girls of Afghanistan. A tragedy unfolds in front of our eyes. We heard earlier from I would imagine the outgoing Afghan ambassador to the United Nations, given that his political leadership has now been ousted in Afghanistan. He talked about how this was of particular concern given some of the human rights violations they had witnessed on the ground as those provincial capitals in Afghanistan began to fall and certainly progress towards the recapturing by the Taliban of the capital of Kabul. So a great deal of concern. You heard concern from the Secretary General, a number of council members speaking to that. It's unclear what exactly the Security Council will be able to do as a collective if they are just going to issue a statement later today.
So, Sherwin, we've seen visuals saying people are running away, trying to flee the Taliban's rule. The U.S. announcing at the weekend that it will be sending troops, a total of 6,000, you say, to help evacuation efforts from Kabul airport. In what has been seen as scenes of chaos of those people that we said are trying to flee. But the thing is, how is this playing out in the United States? You mentioned Joe Biden and how he presides over this situation. What are we expecting from him in explanation of what exactly is going on?
Well, this is about directing blame. I would imagine, certainly in President Biden's defense. He is supposed to come out later today to address this for the first time since the fall of Kabul. And remember, this comes within the context, or certainly from the rhetoric out of the White House, that this would be an orderly transition, that everything was going to go according to a timeline. And U.S. troops were not supposed to be sent back into Afghanistan, but were withdrawing. And now we see 6,000 troops being sent back in there to assist with evacuations. So this orderly transition has not been borne out. The president will be on the defense today. He has to come out and attribute the failing somewhere, and they are going to come out and blame the fallen Afghan government. You heard the Secretary of State there, Antony Blinken, talking about how many billions of dollars the U.S. has invested in capacitating the Afghan army, a 300,000 strong Afghan army using the latest U.S. equipment, infrastructure, including an air force, and none of that was brought to bear in the defense of the capital, Kabul, at all. I mean, essentially, the Taliban walked into the city as President Ashraf Ghani fled to Tajikistan. So you're going to see Washington here try to shift the blame towards the failures of that investment, essentially, in the Afghan military, essentially capitulating Tsepiso and not defending the homeland as was Washington's expectations at least a week ago.
All right, thanks, Sherwin. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our correspondent out there in New York, watching the situation. We'll hear more from him.